We've talked about the supply, the very strong demand, and we've talked about the supply, or the likely increase in supply, we'll say that, of the exporting nations. But let's look, we'll say that, because I actually think the real problem will be the supply of grain stroke rice in the existing main sort of consuming nations, such as China and such as India. And it's there, we'll say that I think the biggest threat in terms of lies will say that water and the availability of water will say that is going to limit food production in those countries in a never bigger way carrying forward. Let's take China let's take India first. And first of all, its population is expected to grow from 1,100 million to 1,590 million by 2050. I don't know whether it'll happen, I'm sure it won't, we'll say, but that's the prediction. So hugely increased demand. If you look, we'll say that zero in at one or two areas, we'll just take a couple of situations. First of all, the most fertile area in India is the Punjab. There's been free electricity for pumping water for donkey's years, and we'll say free anything leads to excessive usage, and the aquifers in the Punjab are now falling very, very quickly. So in terms of stored water, the underground stores, they're depleting. But there's a second and a bigger threat also looming, we'll say that the Ganges River rises. That a big part of its supply comes from the ice melt coming from the glaciers on the Himalayas. The Gangotri Glacier, which is one of the biggest in the world, it's actually shrinking by about 7% a year. So think about this: the very, very heavy rains in Asia, winter rains, that now we'll say are captured as ice, and we'll say that is gradually released in terms of the summer melt, and so that the Ganges, 70% of its flow during the summer, when you really need irrigation, comes from that ice melt. Okay, 70%. So if we'll say the glaciers, as predicted by 2035, this glacier and many other Himalayan ones are just about gone. If that happens, the heavy winter rains fall, race out to sea, causing damage, flooding and everything else like that. And the Ganges probably would just about be dry in summertime. So huge looming threat to food supplies worldwide. Asia, China and India are the two largest growers of wheat and rice. So anything that hits their ability to produce their own food is very serious. Switch now, we'll say, to China. And China, will say, that has only about 25% of the water availability of the rest of the world. But when you break it down, we'll say, into the south of China, that's the Yangtze. And there's plenty, broadly, there's a big problem with pollution of the Yangtze, but broadly there's enough water in that system. It's when you get to northern China that the problem kicks in. The Yellow River, which is their main river network, will say that it doesn't actually reach the sea more days than it reaches the sea, and that's what's happening at the minute. We'll say that the aquifers in northern China are dropping by 5, 6, 7 feet a year. So I mean that there's a limit to how long you can keep doing this. And northern China is where a bit more than 2/3 of their crops are actually grown, and they're heavily dependent on irrigation. China uses irrigation more than any other country worldwide. Once you haven't the water to irrigate, then we'll say that the crop yields drop by more than 60%. Now that's the underground stores of water are depleting. Now let's look at the overground stores. The glaciers, again, we'll say that coming on the Tibet Qinghai, the glaciers are also depleting quite rapidly and are expected to be largely gone by 2060. Again, exactly the same thing, trend as in Asia, as in India. If you don't have the glaciers supplying summer ice melt, then we'll say that the Yellow River will not be available to irrigate for most of the time of the year when when it's really needed. So big problems emerging. Serious enough, by the way, that now this is coupled with. That's just, we'll say, the demand for sort of the supply of water. That's coupled also, if you go to China, as people move into cities, what actually happens? Flush toilets, showers, and so on. In China, a person in a city uses about 10 times more water than somebody in the country. And as people have the means to pay for water, it's difficult to deny them. Water for industry is growing at a rate of about 8 to 10% a year. And so, in terms of China's industrialization and urbanization, it's creating more and more of a demand for water. So where will this water come from? And the Chinese are, they're very clever people, will say that they're well aware of this threat. So they're bringing a canal, hugely expensive canal, from the Yangtze up to the Yellow River systems. But in terms of, if you look to 2030, the extra amount of water that they can bring in through this canal will be about 1/6 of the extra water that they need for cities and for industry. It's a serious problem, by the way. 2/3 of Chinese cities have regular water shortages of note. 2/3 already. And the Chinese Minister for Water reckons that 40% of Chinese already do not have enough water consumption per day, and that people are at quite serious risk. So it's a big problem already. But when you think of, we'll say that of where they're going to be in, say, 2030 or thereabouts, there will be an enormous shortage of water, and it can either only come from agriculture, and if it does, it's hugely at the expense of their crop yields. So they will. The US estimates that by 2030, China will need to import the entire quantity of grain that's exported at the moment. And if they do that, what about the 200 other countries that actually import grain? So there's a huge imbalance coming in this sort of area. There's always possible solutions, and it's interesting, and I haven't mentioned it in the paper because it's actually happened, at least I've only become aware of it since I wrote the paper 3 months ago. The Chinese are now negotiating with the Russians to get access to water from Lake Baikal, a huge lake in Siberia. And it's over this kind of issue that I suspect that wars will be fought in the future, because it'll be very, very interesting to see the result of that negotiation. But generally, the picture is that India's ability to grow anywhere near as much food as it's growing at the moment will not exist within 10, 15, 20 years. So this is why I'm suggesting, as Peter Brabeck did, that the fixation on global warming is misplaced. The real imminent problem, and certain problem for the human race, is actually feeding itself. So innovation and whatever, a new technology, it may lead, and I hope it does, to proving me absolutely and utterly wrong. And it's worth noting that the human race is most innovative generally when the need is greatest. But generally, the picture I'm painting is, we'll say that hunger, famine, major social unrest are very, very likely to increase substantially. And political instability, revolution, much more likely. Terrorism will have a fairly fertile breeding ground, and many wars will be fought this century over water, energy, and food. So the effects on milk price. The effects of, we'll say, more expensive energy and more expensive grain, it will be devastating on on confinement dairying. And remember, that is most of the world's dairying. It will be devastating unless they have, on average, a much higher price going forward than, we'll say, that they had prior to 06. For New Zealand farmers, there are still risks. And next slide, please. It's worth having a look in terms of what led to the rapid increase in prices in 07. If you actually look at the rundown of stocks, that's stock change in 04, 05, 06, it's actually quite small. They are about a little over 6 million tonnes of stocks. Very quite small changes can have major effects on the world market. Could we move on, Paul? So just really it was the depletion of US and EU stocks. When stocks are exhausted, consumption in the short run cannot grow faster than supply. Can we move on? What I want you to take from this slide is, we'll say, that that how small the world traded market is relative to total production. It's only 7 or 8% of total production. So you have the situation that somewhere like New Zealand, 3% of total production worldwide is 32% or so of the world traded market. But the risks in particular to the market would come, we'll say, that on the production side would come, we'll say, from, if you look at the EU, 25% of world production, 31% of the world market. The EU was plus 50% of the world market before quotas. Since April, we'll say that the EU quotas have been raised by 2%. It doesn't sound much, but it's 2% of 25% of the world's production. If that 2% is actually produced, it's about equivalent to 15% of New Zealand's production. So if the EU actually produces 2%, that it's now allowed to do, if the EU farmers do, and the 1% that's projected each year, that will have a significant impact on world markets. It's actually quite a lot of milk in terms of a very small world market. And so it's a big question. Will the EU actually produce that extra 2%? Personally, I don't think it will, but it's one of the things to watch out for going forward. Again, if you look at in terms of total production, the US 15% of total production, but we'll say that 8% of the world traded market in that year, which was 06. Something like about 10% in 07. And the US has come from being a tiny supplier onto the world market, only 2 or 3%, to about 10%, and very, very quickly. So that the increase that has been happening in production in the US, if that continues, that will have a major impact. Is it likely to continue? A particular ratio that the US farmers are very responsive to is milk price to feed grain ratio. And when that's favourable, milk production tends to increase pretty quickly. In the last 2 or 3 months, that particular ratio has turned very, very unfavourable. So if normal trends continue, we'll say that milk production should likely slow down in the States. But these are the kind of risks on the production side. And so they will obviously be blips going forward, given it's the world traded market. It's such a small market that there will be occasional surpluses. But given the very high cost base of, in particular, EU farmers and US farmers, especially in this era of expensive grain and expensive energy, if low prices are maintained for any length of time, the high-cost producers cannot sustain that and will go broke very quickly in a less subsidised sort of situation going forward. So I believe even when the market is flooded a wee bit, I think we'll say those blips will be quite short-lived, and I think we'll say that the prices will recover very, very quickly. So what's the message, we'll say, for New Zealand dairy farmers, grass-based dairy farmers, and grass-based dairy farmers anywhere? As long as, we'll say that the people remember, we'll say the traditional strengths of New Zealand dairying, and observe those, absolutely excellent grassland management, control that cost base, and be careful in terms of not substantially overpaying for land. Then if people are mindful of those, then I think the medium to long-term outlook for New Zealand grass-based dairy farmers is absolutely excellent. Thanks very much.